It was December 2019, and I was living alone in a small house on the outskirts of town. The neighborhood was quiet, almost eerily so, and I enjoyed the solitude it offered. My only companion was Max, my loyal German shepherd. He had been by my side for years, a steadfast protector and my greatest source of comfort during the long, lonely evenings. That winter was bitterly cold. Frost would creep across the windows like ghostly fingers, and the chill seemed to seep into the very bones of the house. Most nights, I wrapped myself in a thick blanket, parked on the living room couch, and let the murmur of the television fill the oppressive silence. Max would usually be curled up beside me, a warm, reassuring presence in the icy darkness. But that December, something changed. Around 2 a.m. every night, without fail, Max would leave my side. His nails would click against the wooden floor as he made his way downstairs to the living room, where he would bark, sharp, urgent barks that cut through the silence like a knife. At first, I chalked it up to typical dog behavior. Maybe he'd heard raccoons rummaging through the trash or a stray cat slinking through the yard. But his nightly ritual became unnerving. It wasn't just the barking, it was how he barked. Max wasn't scared. He was alert, his tone more warning than fearful, as though he was warding off something unseen. Each night, after several minutes, he would trot back upstairs and settle into his bed like nothing had happened. But the air in the house felt heavier, the nights colder, and I found myself growing increasingly uneasy. Then came one Friday night, colder than the others. I was in the living room, trying to distract myself with a movie. Max lay at my feet, his ears twitching occasionally at the muffled sounds from the screen. My eyes flicked to the clock, 1:57 a.m. Right on cue, Max stood up. His ears perked, and he slowly walked toward the basement door. I paused the movie and watched him, my heart beginning to race. He stopped at the door, staring at it intently, and let out a low, guttural growl that sent shivers down my spine. The growl deepened, and then the barking began, loud, sharp, and insistent, echoing through the quiet house. His body was tense, his nose almost pressed to the basement door, tail stiff like a rod. This wasn't random. Max wasn't barking at nothing. He was focused, locked in, as though he could see something that I couldn't. Adrenaline coursed through me as I grabbed a flashlight from the coffee table. My palms felt clammy despite the chill in the air. The silence of the house felt oppressive now, pressing down on me as I made my way toward the door. The air seemed heavier, the kind of weight that makes it hard to breathe. Standing in front of the basement door, I hesitated. Max's barking grew louder, almost frantic, as if urging me to act. Slowly, with my heart hammering in my chest, I reached out and cracked the door open just enough to shine the flashlight down the stairs. The beam of light cut through the darkness, but it revealed nothing. Just the empty steps leading into the black void below. And yet, the air at the threshold was icy, far colder than the rest of the house, and carried with it an inexplicable, suffocating dread. Max's growls deepened beside me. Whatever was down there, it wasn't nothing. The beam of light cut through the thick, suffocating darkness, casting an eerie glow on the cluttered basement. Old boxes, broken furniture, and scattered tools littered the floor, but at first glance, nothing seemed out of place. Then, just as my eyes began to adjust, I saw it, a shadow. Quick, fleeting, vanishing behind a pile of boxes as if it had never been there at all. My breath caught in my throat. Was it an animal? A raccoon or something else? Or worse, had someone broken in? My mind raced with possibilities. None of them good. My instinct screamed at me to run, to lock the door, and never look back. But this was my house. I couldn't just ignore it. I stood frozen, the flashlight trembling in my hand. My heart hammered in my chest, the silence in the house now unbearable. Instead of going down there alone, I made a decision. I grabbed my phone and called Luke. Luke was the kind of guy who never hesitated to help, no matter the situation. He was braver than I could ever hope to be. When I explained what was happening, he didn't laugh or dismiss it. He just said, "I'll be there in 10 minutes. Those 10 minutes felt like an eternity. Every tick of the clock, every creak of the house, made my skin crawl. Max stayed by the basement door, barking and growling occasionally, his loyalty unwavering. I sat on the couch, gripping the flashlight so tightly my knuckles turned white, jumping at every little noise. When Luke arrived, he didn't waste a second. Armed with his own flashlight, he gave me a reassuring nod. "Let's go," he said, his voice calm but steady. Max followed us, his tail wagging slightly now that Luke was with us, as if sensing that the presence of a friend made everything feel less ominous. We stepped into the basement together, the wooden stairs creaking beneath our weight. The air down there was damp and heavy, the scent of mildew sharp in my nostrils. The beam of our flashlights swept across the room, illuminating only piles of old junk. But as we moved closer to the corner behind a stack of boxes, something made me stop. There, crouched in the darkness, was a man. His body was hunched, arms wrapped tightly around his knees, trembling as he sat on the cold concrete floor. He was thin, his clothes tattered and covered in grime. His eyes widened when the light hit him, and he flinched, holding up his hands defensively as if bracing for impact. "Please," he begged, his voice shaking. "Don't call the police. I'm sorry, I'll leave. Just don't call the cops." Luke and I exchanged a glance, unsure of what to do. The man's words tumbled out in a desperate rush, his voice cracked with emotion. He told us that he had been living in the basement for weeks. He wasn't a criminal. His wife had died earlier that year, and he had lost everything: his home, his job, his sense of security. One cold night, he explained, he found the front door of my house slightly ajar. He didn't mean to intrude. He was only looking for a place to sleep, to escape the brutal winter. He never intended to scare me. He would come out only at night, when the house was quiet, to scrounge for food. "I'm sorry," he repeated, tears streaming down his face. "I never wanted to hurt anyone." His story hit me harder than I expected. I couldn't imagine the kind of pain he had been through, the grief of losing everything and everyone. I stood there, torn between empathy and fear. The thought of calling the police crossed my mind. He had been living in my basement after all, but then I realized he wasn't dangerous. In that moment, it felt like the world had shifted, and I was no longer sure what was right or wrong. Should I call for help? Or should I show compassion? Luke looked at me, his expression unreadable. Whatever I decided, we couldn't just leave him there. But what happened next would change everything I thought I knew about the man hiding in my basement. He was just a man, pushed to the brink of his existence. He had reached the end of his rope, a place where hope had all but evaporated. But in that moment, I couldn't help but feel an overwhelming sense of compassion. I told him he didn't need to sneak around anymore, that he didn't have to hide in my basement. Max, Luke, and I helped him to his feet, guiding him upstairs. I gave him food and a warm blanket, things I'd taken for granted, but to him, they were lifelines. He ate ravenously, as if he hadn't seen a proper meal in days. He kept apologizing, repeatedly telling me that he would leave and never come back. But I couldn't just send him back into the cold night. Instead, I gave him some money, a small gesture to help him find his way. I drove him to a nearby shelter where he could get the support he so desperately needed. As I dropped him off, his eyes welled with tears, and he thanked me over and over, his gratitude raw and sincere. That night, I returned home, exhausted but relieved. Max curled up at my feet, a comforting presence as I sat on the couch. The house, once filled with tension, was now finally quiet. But my mind wasn't at ease. I kept thinking about the man, the pain he'd endured, and how fragile our lives truly are. It could have been any of us slipping through the cracks. Since then, I always double-check my doors before bed. More than that, I've learned to hold on to a little more compassion. Sometimes, people just need a helping hand to find their way again. Before we dive into the next story, if you're here for the first time, make sure to subscribe to the channel and hit the bell icon for upcoming scary tales. We truly appreciate your support. Please share these stories with your friends and family. Thanks for being here. When I was young, I was determined to prove I could live on my own. My parents thought I wasn't ready, but I wanted to show them that I could handle the independence. So, I rented a small apartment through Airbnb. It was new, clean, and located in a good area. At first, everything seemed perfect. I unpacked my things, set up my life, and began adjusting to living alone. But soon, strange things started happening. I had a toddler, my little son Adam, who loved playing with his toys and babbling away, even though most of his words didn't make sense yet. One day, I heard him laughing and talking to someone in his room. I peeked in, expecting to see him playing with his stuffed animals. Instead, I found him sitting on the floor, staring at a blank spot in the corner, his little mouth moving as if having a full conversation. I asked him, "Who are you talking to?" He just pointed to the corner and said, "My dog." At first, I didn't think much of it. Kids have wild imaginations, right? But the next day, things took a darker turn. He started yelling at the same corner, his face red with anger, as though he was arguing with someone I couldn't see. I couldn't calm him down. He kept pointing at the corner, shouting, "Bad. Go away." That night, I woke up feeling strange. My chest felt heavy, like something was pressing down on me, suffocating me. I couldn't move, couldn't scream. It was like a nightmare, but far too real. When I finally snapped out of it, I looked down at my arms and saw red scratches running along my skin, deep and angry. The next few nights were worse. I would wake up gasping for air, bruises and scratches appearing from nowhere, as though something unseen had marked me. I couldn't explain it. During the day, I worked a night shift with my mom at a government building. One night, something happened that I'll never forget. The building had security cameras set up in the parking lot, and employees could watch the footage while waiting for their shifts to start. I glanced at the monitors and froze. There on the screen was a large black shape near my car. It wasn't a person. It wasn't an animal. It looked vaguely like a dog, but there were no clear features. Just a dark, blurry outline, low to the ground, slinking like a predator. I stared at it, trying to convince myself it was just a trick of the light, a shadow from the cameras. But then it moved closer to my car, circling it, as if waiting for me. I didn't tell anyone. I wanted to handle it myself, to prove that I wasn't scared. But the next night, it happened again. The black figure appeared on the cameras, doing the same thing, stalking around my car, never acknowledging the other cars, only mine. That night, when I went home, everything felt off. The apartment was too quiet. For the first time in weeks, I didn't wake up with scratches or bruises. It felt like the figure had stayed behind, trapped at work, or so I thought. But I was wrong. My mom lived out in the countryside with my grandparents, and there was a shortcut through the woods that connected their house to hers. Little did I know, that shortcut would soon lead me into something far more terrifying than I ever imagined. Eggs beneath my feet seemed louder than usual. Then I heard it, a low growl. It wasn't a normal growl. It was deep, rumbling, and full of pure, raw anger. My heart began to race. I turned around, half expecting to see an animal behind me, but instead I saw it. The same black figure from the parking lot, standing at the edge of the trail, half hidden in the shadows. It had no face, no eyes, yet I felt it staring at me. Its body seemed to ripple and shift like smoke, undulating even though it remained in place. I turned and started walking faster, trying to ignore the chill crawling up my spine. But the growl grew louder, and I could hear its heavy footsteps crunching through the leaves behind me. It was following me. I didn't run. I knew that if I ran, it would chase me. My chest tightened, my legs felt like lead, but I kept walking, determined to reach my mom's house. Then, the sound pierced the silence, a howl. Not like anything I'd ever heard before. A deep, guttural wail filled with rage and sorrow. It echoed through the woods, and for a moment, the trees around me seemed to shrink, as if they were closing in. In that instant, I knew if it caught me, I wouldn't make it out alive. Somehow, I managed to make it to my mom's house. I slammed the door behind me, locking it tight. My mom, startled, asked me what was wrong. All I could say was, "Something's in the woods." She looked at me, wide-eyed, and then she said something that froze my blood. "I've seen it too." She told me that she had noticed the same black figure on the security cameras at work. It was then that I realized. It wasn't just in my head. Whatever it was, it had followed me home. I stayed with my mom that night, terrified to return to my apartment. The scratches stopped, and the nightmares eventually faded. But I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever had been hunting me, it wasn't done yet. Years later, when I was in college, I shared a small off-campus apartment with my best friend, Jamie. We were both a little unconventional, preferring quiet nights and odd adventures over the usual party scene. One cold October night, we decided to take a walk around the neighborhood. It was past 2 a.m., and the streets were completely silent, save for the occasional rustle of leaves. We weren't drunk, just bored and restless, searching for something to do. As we wandered past a stretch of dimly lit shops, we saw it, a large, black dog lying in the gutter. Its fur was matted and dull, its body stiff, an unmistakable sign of death. A dark, greasy smear was under its head, and it didn't take much imagination to guess it had been hit by a car. "Poor thing," Jamie muttered, kneeling beside it for a moment. We didn't linger long. The sight was unsettling, and there was nothing we could do. We continued our walk, eventually reaching a small park a few blocks away. The swings creaked softly in the breeze, and the streetlights cast long, eerie shadows over the pavement. We sat on a bench for a while, chatting about nothing in particular, just enjoying the peace and quiet of the late hour. About an hour later, we decided to head back. As we approached the stretch of road where we had seen the dog, a car passed by, its headlights cutting through the darkness. And then we saw it again, the same black dog, alive. It crossed the street in front of us, moving slowly, almost limping. Its shadow stretched unnaturally long beneath the streetlight. Jamie froze mid-step. "Did you see that?" he whispered, his voice tight with fear. I nodded, my mouth suddenly dry. We hurried back to the spot where we had first seen it, expecting to find the dog's lifeless body still there. But when we reached the gutter, it was empty. The greasy smear remained, dark and glistening, but the dog was gone. We didn't say much as we continued walking back to our apartment, the silence between us thick with unease. Neither of us spoke of it aloud, but we both knew something wasn't right. Something was following us. The path through the woods was narrow and overgrown, and it could only be walked, not driven. It was a short walk, just about half a mile, but on this evening, the air felt heavier than usual. The sun was setting, casting long shadows across the trail. At first, everything seemed peaceful, but halfway through, an unsettling feeling crept over me. It was as if someone or something was watching me. I shook it off, telling myself it was just my imagination. The woods had a way of playing tricks on you, especially when the sounds of rustling leaves and snapping twigs echoed through the trees. But then, I heard it, a low, rumbling growl. It wasn't like any growl I'd heard before. This one was deep and full of anger. My heart started pounding, and I turned, half expecting to see a bear or a wild animal, but instead, I saw it. The black figure from the parking lot, the one I had seen on the security cameras, was standing at the edge of the trail. It was half hidden in the shadows, but I could feel its presence. It had no eyes, no face. Its body rippled, almost like smoke, but it remained perfectly still. I began walking faster, my steps growing shaky. The growl grew louder, its heavy footsteps crunching the leaves behind me. I didn't dare run. I knew that if I did, it would chase me. I kept moving, heart racing, as the growl echoed through the trees. Then, without warning, it let out a sound, a howl that seemed to vibrate through my bones. It wasn't like any animal sound I had ever heard. It was long, deep, and full of rage. The trees around me seemed to shrink, as if the very forest itself was closing in. I knew that if I didn't make it out of those woods soon, I wouldn't make it out alive. Somehow, I made it to my mom's house, slamming the door behind me and locking it. My mom was startled, asking me what was wrong, but I couldn't explain. All I could say was, "Something's in the woods." She looked at me, eyes wide with fear. "I've seen it too," she whispered. She told me about the black figure she had seen on the cameras at work. That's when it hit me. It wasn't just my imagination. It had followed me home. I stayed with my mom after that, too scared to return to my apartment. The scratches on my arm stopped, and the nightmares faded, but I never felt safe again. The creature, whatever it was, seemed to haunt me, lurking just beyond the edge of my vision. It wasn't until I moved away that I thought I'd finally left it behind. But now, even years later, I can't shake the feeling that it's still out there, waiting. Sometimes, when the wind howls just right and the shadows grow long, I hear that deep growl again, an eerie reminder that some things never truly go away.